What if the coolest character on one of America's most beloved sitcoms was terrified of motorcycles the entire time he was riding them? Or that the show nearly had a completely different name, a different Fonzie, and almost never survived its first season? Happy Days looked like a warm and uncomplicated celebration of 1950s American life. But the story behind 11 seasons of Arnold's drive-in and leather jackets was considerably stranger than anything that happened in Richie Cunningham's living room. Here are 15 weird facts about Happy Days 1974 you didn't know. Fact 15. The show was almost called Cool before Happy Days had a title. Creator Gary Marshall had a different name in mind for the series he was developing. Marshall wanted to call the show Cool. A single word he felt captured the rock and roll spirit of the 1950s setting and the attitude he was trying to bring to the characters. The word fit the era, fit the tone, and fit the character who would eventually become the show's most recognizable figure. Network executives at ABC did not agree with the choice. Their objection was not about the word itself, but about what it communicated to viewers flipping through a television guide. Cool told you nothing about what the show actually was, who it was about, or why you should watch it. A title needed to do more work than a single adjective, and they pushed Marshall toward something more descriptive. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the replacement title did exactly what the network wanted. Happy Days communicated warmth, nostalgia, and a specific emotional register before a single episode aired. It told the audience what they were being promised before they sat down. Marshall accepted the change and moved forward. The show that became one of the most watched programs on American television through the latter half of the 1970s went out under a name its creator had not originally chosen. Cool as a title disappeared entirely from the conversation and never came up publicly until Marshall discussed the original idea in interviews years later. The show that became Happy Days might have been remembered as something else entirely if the network had simply agreed with the person creating it. Before moving ahead, take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next story. Fact 14. The show started as a segment on a different program. Happy Days did not begin as a weekly series. Its origin was considerably more modest. The pilot episode was produced as a segment for the ABC anthology series Love, American Style, which aired unrelated, standalone comedy stories each week under a loosely romantic theme. The Happy Days pilot aired within that format in 1972, 2 years before the show received its own weekly time slot. The segment featured Ron Howard as Richie Cunningham and established the basic premise of a teenage boy navigating life in 1950s Milwaukee. It was well received enough that ABC filed it away as a potential series, but the network did not immediately greenlight a full production. The concept sat in development while other programming decisions were made. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, what revived the concept was a film rather than anything that happened on television. George Lucas's American Graffiti was released in 1973 and became a cultural phenomenon, demonstrating that there was a large appetite for nostalgic stories set in the American 1950s. ABC looked at their Love, American Style segment with new interest after the film's success and ordered a series. Ron Howard, Hanson Williams, and Marion Ross were the only performers from the original pilot segment who transitioned into the weekly series. The rest of the cast was assembled fresh for the show that eventually premiered in January of 1974. The show that ran for 11 seasons began as a single segment in an anthology program that most people have forgotten. Its path from that format to a weekly series required 2 years of waiting and a George Lucas film to remind a network that the concept they already owned was worth developing. Fact 13. Fonzie was never supposed to be a main character. When Happy Days was developed as a weekly series, the Fonzie character was designed as a supporting figure. Henry Winkler was cast to play a cool older kid who existed at the edge of Richie Cunningham's world, someone who added color and contrast to the show's central family dynamic without claiming the center of the story for himself. The Cunningham household was the show and Richie was its protagonist. Fonzie was atmosphere. The audience had a different idea. From the earliest episodes, viewer response to Fonzie was disproportionate to the size of his role. Mail came in. Fan attention concentrated on Winkler in a way that the network and the producers could not ignore for long. The character, who had been conceived as peripheral, was connecting with audiences more strongly than the characters who had been built to carry the series. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the production responded by expanding Fonzie's role steadily through the early seasons. More screen time, more storylines, more scenes that required Winkler to carry material rather than simply react to it. By the third season, the character had moved from the edges of the show to its center, and Fonzie's apartment above the Cunningham garage had been established as a regular location. The transition created some tension with the show's original premise, which had been built around the Cunningham family rather than around a single outsider character. Gary Marshall navigated the shift carefully, expanding Fonzie while maintaining enough of the family dynamics to keep the show's original identity intact. What began as a secondary character became the most culturally recognizable figure the show produced, remembered decades later in a way that overshadowed nearly everyone else who appeared across 11 seasons. Fact 12. Henry Winkler was terrified of motorcycles. Fonzie's motorcycle was one of the most iconic props in 1970s American television. The bike was part of the character's visual identity from the beginning, a central element of what made him look and feel like someone operating outside the conventional expectations that governed everyone else in Richie Cunningham's world. It appeared in promotional materials, in opening sequences, and in countless episodes where the Fonz's arrival at Arnold's was announced by the sound of an engine. Henry Winkler was genuinely afraid of motorcycles throughout the entire run of the show. The fear was not abstract. Early in the production, a scene required him to rev the bike and move it forward approximately 5 feet on the soundstage. Winkler, confused by the controls, sent the motorcycle shooting forward faster than he had intended. The show's director of photography had to leap out of the way to avoid being hit. Winkler and the bike slid under a truck parked on the soundstage. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the immediate aftermath revealed something about production priorities that Winkler recalled with dry humor in later interviews. The first concern from the crew was whether the rented motorcycle was undamaged. The second concern was whether Winkler was all right. After that incident, the production made adjustments that allowed Winkler to play a motorcycle riding character without requiring him to actually ride one. Scenes that showed the Fonz in motion on the bike were typically filmed with the motorcycle secured to a platform pulled by a truck, giving Winkler the appearance of riding without requiring him to control the vehicle. The coolest character on the show was scared of the object most associated with his coolness for 11 seasons, and the production built an entire approach to filming around that fear without ever disclosing it to the audience. Fact 11. Fonzie's leather jacket almost did not make it past the first season. The brown leather jacket that Henry Winkler wore as Fonzie became one of the most recognized pieces of television wardrobe in American broadcast history. It eventually ended up in the Smithsonian Institution alongside Archie Bunker's chair and other artifacts deemed significant enough to become permanent national exhibits. What most people do not know is that the jacket nearly disappeared from the show entirely before it had a chance to become iconic. ABC executives in the early seasons were uncomfortable with the leather jacket as a regular costume element. Their concern was that the jacket read as gang-affiliated and potentially threatening to the mainstream audience the network was trying to attract. Leather jackets in the early 1970s still carried associations with motorcycle gangs and juvenile delinquency that made network executives nervous about building a character's visual identity around one. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the compromise that was negotiated to keep the jacket in production was specific and somewhat absurd. Fonzie was only permitted to wear the leather jacket when he was near or on his motorcycle, because the motorcycle provided a legitimate contextual reason for the outfit. In scenes set away from the bike, the character was supposed to appear in a cloth windbreaker instead. The restriction was eventually dropped as Fonzie's popularity made the network more willing to accommodate the character's visual identity without conditions. By the time the jacket had become synonymous with the character in the public imagination, nobody was raising objections to it anymore. Winkler had purchased the jacket from a thrift store. The object that ended up behind protective glass in a national museum cost almost nothing when it first entered the wardrobe department. Fact 10. Chuck Cunningham simply ceased to exist in the first 2 seasons of Happy Days. The Cunningham family included an older son named Chuck. He was Richie's brother, a college student who appeared occasionally in family scenes, played basketball, and occupied a specific place in the household's dynamics. He was not a particularly developed character, but he existed within the show's established world as a genuine family member. When the show moved into its 3rd season, Chuck was gone, not written out with a departure story or an explanation of where he had gone, simply absent. The family continued operating as if Chuck had never existed. No dialogue acknowledged the missing son. No episode addressed the gap. The Cunninghams became a 3-child family reduced to 2 children without the show ever accounting for the change. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, this disappearance became so well known in television fandom that it gave a name to a recurring phenomenon. When a character vanishes from a show without any in-universe explanation, it is often referred to as Chuck Cunningham syndrome, named specifically for this Happy Days situation. 2 different actors played Chuck across the first 2 seasons, which suggests the character was never particularly stable as a creative commitment. The first actor appeared in the original pilot segment, and the second appeared in the network series before the role was abandoned entirely. Chuck Cunningham had a bedroom in the house, a seat at the dinner table, and an established relationship with every member of his family. Then, he had nothing, because the writers stopped writing him, and the show never looked back. He remains one of the most complete fictional disappearances in the history of American sitcoms. Fact 9. The Fonzie jumping the shark episode coined a phrase that outlasted the show in September of 1977 during the show's 5th season. An episode aired in which Fonzie donned a leather jacket over swim trunks and jumped over a live shark on water skis. The 3-part Hollywood episode had taken the cast to California for a vacation storyline that required increasingly elaborate set pieces, culminating in the shark stunt. The production filmed it, it aired, and the show continued for 6 more seasons. What the episode produced beyond its immediate broadcast was a permanent addition to the English language. John Hine, a radio personality, coined the phrase "jumping the shark" in 1985 to describe the moment when a television show signals its creative decline through an act of desperate attention-seeking. The Fonzie shark jump became the defining example of a concept that applied to the entire history of television. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, Henry Winkler has always pushed back on the narrative in interviews, pointing out that the show remained #1 in the ratings for years after the episode aired. The audience that was supposedly signaling its exhaustion with the show kept watching in enormous numbers. Whatever the episode communicated about the show's creative trajectory, it did not immediately translate into viewership decline. The phrase entered the permanent vocabulary used to describe creative decisions in every medium, not just television. Movies, books, sports teams, and political careers are now described as having jumped the shark when they make choices that feel like overreach. Fonzie's water ski stunt created a phrase that outlasted the show by decades and is used by people who have never seen a single episode of Happy Days. That specific kind of cultural permanence was not something anyone on the production was aiming for when they wrote the scene. Fact 8. Ron Howard made his directorial debut on the show he was starring in. Ron Howard had been a professional actor since childhood, with significant credits going back to The Andy Griffith Show, where he played Opie Taylor for 8 seasons. By the time Happy Days was running in the mid-1970s, he had spent the majority of his life in front of cameras and had developed a specific and informed understanding of how television productions actually worked from the inside. Howard had ambitions that went beyond performing. While continuing to play Richie Cunningham on Happy Days, he was quietly working toward a directing career in parallel, making small films and made-for-television movies during breaks in the production schedule. His actual directorial debut on the show that was employing him as an actor came in 1977. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, Howard was initially reluctant to push for directing opportunities on the show he was starring in, citing the awkward dynamic of being a cast member telling his colleagues how to play scenes. He was also skeptical about whether directing Happy Days episodes would actually advance his career, noting in interviews that Richard Thomas had directed episodes of The Waltons without it generating any particular industry attention. He eventually made the transition anyway and built a directing career during his Happy Days years that positioned him for the feature work that followed. Night Shift in 1982 was his first significant film success, and Splash in 1984 established him as a feature director at exactly the moment he was departing the show that had employed him for most of a decade. Howard left Happy Days in 1980. He went on to direct films including Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and Frost/Nixon. The directing career that began with a Happy Days episode eventually produced an Academy Award for Best Director. Fact 7. Most of the cast was far too old to play teenagers' Happy Days was set in the mid-1950s and centered on a group of high school and college-age characters navigating teenage life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The casting that was assembled to play those characters was not drawn from the teenage population. It was drawn from adult actors in their 20s who were old enough to hold the work legally and physically manage the production demands of a weekly series. Henry Winkler, who played the older and supposedly more mature Fonzie, was 28 years old when the show premiered. He was the oldest of the central cast, playing a character who was positioned as maybe a year or two ahead of the high school kids. Most of the others playing those high school kids were in their mid-20s. The show was asking viewers to accept adults as teenagers across its entire regular cast. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, this was not an unusual practice in American television during the era. The industry had established patterns of casting adult actors in teenage roles going back decades, driven by the practical and legal complications of working with actual minors on regular production schedules. The gap was most visible when the show attempted storylines that required physically demanding material or when characters appeared in situations that would have been genuinely awkward for the ages being portrayed. Adult actors playing teenagers occupy a slightly different register on screen from what actual teenagers produce, and sustained viewing tends to reveal the difference even when individual scenes conceal it. The show ran for 11 seasons with this casting approach intact. The characters grew older as the show progressed, which eventually aligned the actors and their roles in ways that the early seasons could not fully achieve. Fact 6. Gary Marshall created 3 major spin-offs from the same show. Happy Days became one of the most productive launching pads for new series in the history of American network television. The show's success and the audience familiarity with its world allowed creator Gary Marshall to introduce new characters and settings that could sustain their own series. And he did this 3 separate times with results that ranged from massive success to moderate failure. Laverne and Shirley was introduced through Happy Days before spinning off into its own series in 1976. The show ran for 8 seasons and at various points during its run outperformed Happy Days itself in the ratings. It remains one of the most successful spin-offs in American television history and produced a cultural footprint that has lasted independently of its parent show. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, Mork and Mindy emerged from a single Happy Days episode in which an alien character named Mork from the planet Orc arrived to study Richie Cunningham. Robin Williams played the character in that guest appearance with enough energy and distinctiveness that ABC ordered a spin-off immediately. Mork and Mindy became a star-making vehicle that introduced Williams to the mainstream television audience. Joni Loves Chachi, which spun off the characters of Richie's sister Joni and her boyfriend Chachi, ran for 2 seasons and was considerably less successful. The show was canceled, and both characters eventually returned to Happy Days for the final seasons. 3 spin-offs from one series, 2 of which became significant television properties in their own right, represents a creative productivity from a single show that has few equivalents in the history of American broadcast television. Fact 5. The exterior scenes were shot in Indiana, not Wisconsin. Happy Days was set in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the production was consistent about establishing that geographical identity through dialogue and cultural references throughout the series. The city of Milwaukee was central to the show's sense of place, and its Midwestern identity informed the specific flavor of the 1950s nostalgia the show was built around. The exterior scenes were not filmed in Milwaukee. Ron Howard revealed in later interviews that the outdoor locations used for Happy Days were shot in Munster, Indiana, a suburban town in the northwestern corner of the state, approximately 50 miles from downtown Chicago. The terrain and architecture provided what the production needed visually without requiring the cast and crew to travel to Wisconsin. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the discrepancy between the stated setting and the actual filming location was invisible to viewers, who had no reason to scrutinize the geography of outdoor scenes in a show they were watching for its characters and stories rather than its location photography. The interior scenes were filmed entirely on sound stages at Paramount Pictures in Los Angeles, which meant that the show's sense of place was constructed entirely from a combination of Indiana exteriors and California sound stages without any actual connection to the city the story was supposed to be taking place in. Milwaukee embraced the show anyway. The city's association with Happy Days became a point of local pride and tourism, with fans visiting locations associated with the show despite the fact that none of the filming had occurred there. The show created a Milwaukee that existed only on television, and the real Milwaukee accepted that television version as part of its own identity. Fact 4. Fonzie's apartment was added because of a network standards objection. When the production established that Fonzie spent time in the Cunningham house, network standards executives raised a concern about what that living arrangement implied. A single adult male spending significant time in a family's home, particularly one with a teenage daughter, created a suggestion that the network found problematic for a family-oriented show aiming at a broad demographic. The solution the production developed was to give Fonzie his own living space that was physically connected to the Cunninghams, but legally and spatially separate from the family home. The apartment above the Cunningham garage provided a defined territory for the character that established clear boundaries while keeping him within the established geography of the show's main setting. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the apartment became one of the show's most recognizable locations. The bathroom that served as Fonzie's space in early seasons before the full apartment was constructed was itself a production compromise that acknowledged the network's concern without fully addressing it. The apartment proper, which arrived as Fonzie's role expanded, resolved the issue by giving the character a proper residence. The creative decision driven by a standards objection ended up enriching the show's world rather than limiting it. The apartment gave Fonzie a place that was his own, which supported storylines about his independence and his complicated position on the edge of the Cunningham family's warmth without being fully absorbed into it. A network concern about propriety produced one of the show's most useful and enduring locations. The apartment that resolved the standards problem became the setting for some of the show's most memorable scenes. Fact 3. The show changed its entire production format after Season 2. The first 2 seasons of Happy Days were filmed using a single camera setup, which was the standard approach for dramatic productions, but was less common for comedy series that typically relied on audience feedback to shape timing and performance. The show used a laugh track over these single camera episodes, which produced a different texture from what a live studio audience provides. One episode late in the second season, titled Fonzie Gets Married, was filmed in front of a live studio audience using 3 cameras as an experiment. The production team wanted to see whether the format that defined most sitcoms of the era would suit Happy Days, and whether the energy of a live audience would change what the performers were able to do in the material. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, The experiment produced results that convinced the production to change the show's format entirely. From the third season onward, Happy Days was filmed as a 3-camera production in front of a live studio audience, a transition that significantly changed the show's feel and its pace. The shift coincided with other changes in the third season, including the expansion of Fonzie's role and the increase in the show's ratings that followed. Whether the format change contributed to the ratings improvement or whether both were products of other decisions made simultaneously is not entirely clear. But the show that emerged from the third season was notably more energetic and audience-responsive than the single-camera version had been. Tom Bosley, who played Howard Cunningham, began announcing at the start of most episodes that Happy Days was filmed before a live audience. That announcement became a fixture of the show's identity for the rest of its run, reminding viewers each week that the laughter they were hearing came from real people in the room. Fact 2. A character played Richie's friend in 1977 became one of the biggest film stars of the 1980s. Happy Days served as an introduction to American television audiences for several performers who went on to significant careers in other formats. The show's reach and the visibility that came with being a regular guest or supporting player in one of the most watched programs of the late 1970s made it a meaningful early credit for people still building their professional profiles. Among the visitors to Arnold's and the Cunningham household during the show's run was a young actor who appeared in a guest role in 1977, playing a character in Richie's Social World. The appearance did not generate particular attention at the time. The show had a rotating cast of guest performers and supporting players across 11 seasons, and individual appearances rarely stood out unless the performer was already famous. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the 1977 guest appearance was made by a performer whose career would produce some of the most commercially successful films of the following decade. The credit existed quietly in the filmography of someone who would later be known for work that had nothing obvious to connect it to Milwaukee in the 1950s. The show accumulated these early credits across its run, functioning as a training ground and visibility platform for performers who were not yet what they eventually became. The guest roster from 11 seasons of Happy Days contains names that mean considerably more in retrospect than they did at the time of filming. Happy Days gave the audience 11 seasons of familiar faces. It gave several performers their first major television exposure before they found the roles that defined their careers elsewhere. Fact 1. Fonzie's leather jacket is in the Smithsonian. Henry Winkler bought the jacket from a thrift store. That is where this story starts. The specific cost has not been publicly documented, but the acquisition was not expensive and was not treated as a significant purchase at the time. It was a costume element for a supporting character on a show that had not yet proven itself to anyone. Winkler found it, it looked right, and it went into the wardrobe rotation. The jacket became the most recognizable piece of clothing on American television through the latter half of the 1970s. It survived the network's early objections to its gang associations, the restriction that initially limited when Fonzie could wear it, and the character's evolution from peripheral figure to the show's central presence. By the time Happy Days ended in 1984, the jacket had been on screen for a decade and had become inseparable from the character wearing it. Among the weird facts about Happy Days 1974, the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History acquired the jacket as a permanent exhibit, placing it alongside other artifacts deemed significant enough to represent American cultural history. The museum that holds Archie Bunker's chair and other television landmarks added Fonzie's leather jacket to that collection. The jacket sits in a display case in Washington, D.C., protected and preserved as a genuine piece of American cultural heritage. A thrift store purchase that was made to costume a supporting character on a network sitcom is now in a national museum, which is a specific kind of journey that nobody involved could have mapped from the starting point. Winkler has spoken about what that means with evident pride and emotion in various interviews over the years. The object that the network once tried to limit because of its threatening associations now occupies the same institutional space as artifacts from American presidents and historical events. A leather jacket from a thrift store worn by a fictional mechanic in a 1950s Milwaukee neighborhood, achieved a form of permanence that most things do not. Happy Days spent 11 seasons celebrating an America that may not have existed quite the way the show remembered it, and did it well enough that the celebration itself became part of what people remember about the 1970s. Which of these facts surprised you most? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss one.